Okay. So I had finished last week, and before I get started, I'll share my screen and I'll do a little overview of what we did last week for those of you who are unable to make it or could just do with a review. I had said that this week, Rabbi Nachum Rabinovich would be kind of the centerpiece around who we would spend our time. But inspired by some of your questions in the aftermath, maybe aftermath is the wrong word, it wasn't quite a natural event, but in the aftermath of last week's sheer number of questions provoked me to spend a little bit more time on some of the steps leading up to Rabbi Rabinovich, and all being well, we will finish with Rabbi Rabinovich and pivot to him next week. So really, the treatment of electricity on Shabbat, we're going to split into 2 weeks, this week and next week. This week we will have the where we reached until 2016, and next week will be electricity on Shabbat after 2016. I know a lot of things changed in 2016, and we'll talk about some of that in this context, the end, and then into next week as well. So what I'll do, I will share my screen with you. And you can let me know if you can see it. Can you see my screen?
Yes, we can.
Excellent. Okay, so a little bit of an overview of last week. Last week, we began with the history of electricity and showed how essentially, though it was peripheral to human endeavor for a long, long time, it was really in the 19th and 20th century that there was a radical burst of innovation that took society by storm, and not only engaged society differently, but flummoxed legal systems across the board. We saw examples in the United States in the Supreme Court cases that dealt with wiretapping in the early 20th century. We had issues we saw in terms of thermal imaging and whether that was deemed an illegal search, even though it's done from the comfort of one's vehicle on the other side of the street. Some of you may have seen last week, Amazon issued a press release about its use of facial recognition technology. Some of you may have seen, I don't know how many of you watch, what's his name? The English guy who does a weekly thing. John something tonight, this week tonight. What's his name?
John Oliver.
John Oliver.
Thank you. Yes, he also did the voice of Zazu in the most recent iteration of The Lion King. Yes, John Oliver does a This Week Tonight, and even though he's a comedian, once a week, he does, I think it's a 25-minute episode on a particular issue, which he kind of does a deep dive in. And last week, or whatever day was Sunday, he did facial recognition technology, and it is an astonishing new field of technology with all sorts of ramifications. And last week, Amazon said that they are, I'm sure it was in the wake of these protests in particular, they said that they are now not allowing law officials to use their facial recognition technology until there is time for legislators to write laws and regulations about it. And Congress hasn't written laws about it yet. So they said, we're putting a pause on sharing this technology with the law enforcement agencies because we need to have regulations here. Specifically, facial recognition technology struggles to recognize those with darker skin tones. So it leads to all sorts of unwarranted arrests and other such things. So that's, I'm sure, why it was in the wake of the protests that Amazon said that, came out with that press release. But new technologies are always abrupt, and they erupt on the scene, and legal systems have to struggle with how to define their reality. So we looked at a couple of the cases in the Supreme Court, and then we turned to halacha. How did halacha confront these issues? And the truth is, in many ways, the halachic response to these changing realities is going to be, just by definition, much harder than something like a living legal system with enforcement agencies. Though halacha is a living system, we don't have enforcement agencies. The rabbi, the RCA can't come to a decision and then find those people who are breaching the rules and put them in jail. However much some of those rabbis might want to do that. We learned that very well in the last few months when rabbis or shuls or lay leaders came up with regulations about how shul should function during this time. There's no way to enforce that. We don't have the legal apparatus. So when decisions are made by who are deemed the great rabbis of the age, we don't even have formal titles. We call them gedolim because we don't have Supreme Court justices. We don't have a system in place. So it's much, much harder to respond to changing facts on the ground because we don't have the enforcement mechanisms. As some of you, I'm sure, saw today, there was a landmark ruling out of the Supreme Court that LGBTQ protections apply in the same way that discrimination against race or sex or gender applies in the workplace. Now, they can make a radical change in constitutional applied law because now all the federal and state agencies are obligated to follow through and enforce that. If a bunch of rabbis come together and say, okay, we're going to change, all these things are now allowed to be done, guess what? All the rabbis who disagree can tell their people not to do it. In this country, if there's a court in New York or Arkansas that says, forget the Supreme Court, I'm not going to keep it, they're going to get thrown in jail. We don't have those mechanisms. So what tends to happen in halakhic life is, over time, we accrue layers of stringency, and conservatism, lowercase c, tends to be the anchor or the weight around halakhic change because in the best sense, what we have to try to do in an age of exile and diaspora is maintain consensus as much as possible. What the Supreme Court has to maintain consensus is quite easy. What do they have to keep consensus?
Majority.
Okay, they got the majority rule, but they've also got the FBI and the police forces, and that keeps people on the same page. In halakhic life, if you want to be able to travel the world and go to a shul and recognize the liturgy or recognize the architecture or recognize the rites of passage, we all need to change as little as possible all the time. So just by definition, halakhic responses to changing matters tends to be slow because we're trying to keep everybody on the same page because we don't have a Supreme Court that's living that can make rules and then spread the memo to the enforcement agency. So just by nature, change is far more slow, far more incremental, and tends to be that conservative voices, lowercase c again, tend to win the day because status quo is easier because then we're all on the same page. And if some people start changing, that changes the page. Unless we all agree to move together, it's much harder. So that's just a little bit of background to how halakhic reactions are going to work. And it's all the more important when it comes to something like electricity because our scientific understanding is shifting all the time. And if the big, so to speak, heavy hitters in the halakhic world had a statement based on the wrong scientific understanding, it's going to be much harder to overturn, so to speak, or shift our reaction because their voice has such weight. And again, our halakhic instinct is we got to keep the status quo because until everybody's on the same page, we're going to be in a lot of trouble. I guess another implication of this or another instantiation of this is in a completely different subject for another time, is stainless steel pots. Scientifically speaking, stainless steel does not absorb taste and it doesn't emit taste. And you can do this study under microscope and all sorts of things. And leading rabbinic figures, including Rav Hershel Schachter, when I was in Smicha doing the halachot of kashrut, said, look, at the end of the day, stainless steel, in theory, you don't need 2 sets, milk and meat, because it doesn't emit or absorb taste. But that's the practice we've all accepted. And if you want to be able to eat in each other's houses, we got to keep this way until all the rabbis get together and agree we can all shift on this. And he said, and what's the likelihood of all the rabbis getting in the same room and agreeing on anything? So for the meantime, you've got to keep your separate stainless steel pots. Because that's the concession that we all make as a community so that we can eat in each other's houses without suspicion, which is reasonable, even if it's difficult. And the truth is, if this feels painful or primitive or archaic, that's precisely what diaspora is. And that's precisely when it comes to Tisha B'Av, although usually we get to Tisha B'Av and it feels almost like an act. Like, why am I saying things are so terrible? We've got access to Israel. We've got freedom in the diaspora. I'm living, please God, comfortably. Please God, those around me are healthy. What am I fussing about on Tisha B'Av? In fact, There were Reform communities in early America that abandoned Tisha B'Av and turned it into a day of celebration, repurposed it. But part of the struggle or the trauma of Tisha B'Av is precisely this. We're praying, bring back the judges. That's what we say every day. Hashiva Shafetenu Kavarishana, bring back our judges, because our system is weighed down by the need to achieve consensus and hold on to status quo, even when there's radical change. So even if there was an aspiration that we all felt strongly, let's talk about the inclusion of women in some things. Until we get across the board approval from Orthodox rabbis, it's very hard to make any changes without being called a heretic or an outsider, and then people won't eat at your house, they won't daven in your shul. So the system is kind of hampered until we can get to a point where we slowly move and shift. If we had the Sanhedrin, they could make a ruling and no one could argue, it'd be done. So that's on Tisha B'Av. That's part of what we're saying. It's Hashiva Shavtenu Karishana, Yagon Va'anacha is part of that bracha. We say that we're experiencing Yagon, pain. What is the pain and the lack of judges? That's the pain that the system is slow and incremental by necessity. And that's part of the condition of exile. Okay, that was a little bit of an aside. We didn't touch on that too much last week, but that was kind of the undercurrent that we've now laid out. Now, what did we do last week? Excellent question. We turned, here's the outline of what we're going to address in terms of the halachic response to electricity. Number one, we said, was agency. When I press a button or I hold something in my hand that's electric, is it me that's doing it or is it a machine? And to some degree, this was similar to the case in the Supreme Court about thermal imaging, meaning, yes, electricity is somehow invading the space of this person's house. If I tap someone's phone, something's going on in the machinery in their house, but it's not me. So the question is, does electricity have an agency from me? Is it me doing it? Which has implications for liability, like wiretapping, or God forbid, murder. If I press a button and a machine starts doing something to somebody, was that me? Or can I deny any connection? So agency is a question with liability and also with obligation. In Jewish life, I always try to think of an example in American law, and it's very hard. Because in American law, there's very rarely an obligation for us to do anything. Most of American law is about the restrictions, and everything else you're free to do whatever you like. If you can think of an obligation that American law imposes on its citizens, that would be helpful. There are a couple that I can think of, which is if you're being a witness, you have to take an oath. There are occasions in which you have to do something. And then when you have to take an oath in American law, we can think about parallels. What if you can't speak? Can somebody say it for you? And that's when we can talk about Shomer Ka'onen, parallels in the legal systems in that way. But in Jewish life, we have obligations, not just liabilities, but things we have to do. So we asked about making tzitzis. We asked about making matzah. We asked about making tefillin. We asked about writing Sifrei Torah. These are obligations on human beings to have agency. And does electricity communicate that agency on my behalf? And there were three fundamental texts in the Gemara that we looked at in terms of agency and connection between human being and result. And the first text we looked at, we do this very briefly outside. The first text we looked at suggested that if I throw a knife and it does a kosher shrita, that's me. So even though I'm not touching the knife at the time of its movement, if I initiated the momentum, I'm connected enough to it that it's me. The second case was if I lift up the gate on a water mill and water goes thrusting out and moves the mill, and there's a knife and it does shchita, or in the more gruesome situation, I tie someone up, lie them on the floor, and I open a dam and water floods out. Is that me? Or can I say, I just moved the fence. The water killed him. I know people often say here, people don't kill people, guns kill people. It's the other way around. Guns don't kill people, people kill people. So that's the question. Does water kill people or do people kill people? If I lift up the gate and I let the waters flood out, is it me? That was the second case. Anyone know remember what the conclusion was with the water? We said the knife is you if you throw it. What did we say about the water? Anyone remember?
The initial water first is yours.
Excellent, exactly. Koach Rishon, the first wave of water, literally, excuse the pun, the first thrust of water is considered to be you. But after that, if you lifted it up and then somebody else lies down and then someone ties them up, there's nothing to do with you. So that initial burst is you. And then the third case in the Gemara that we had was somebody fires an arrow at somebody else who's holding a shield, and you come along and you grab the shield out the way and the arrow kills them, are you liable? And the conclusion in the Talmud was?
Butter.
No, yeah, exactly. None to do with you. I mean, again, ethically, we can have a discussion about whether you should be held liable for something. But legally, you just moved a shield. You had nothing to do with an arrow. You just moved the shield. And those were the three cases. And our basic question was, when you turn on a switch, when you flick on a circuit, what is that most akin to? Is it like you started the momentum, like throwing a knife? And nobody thought that was the case. Nobody thought when you do electricity, it's like you pick up the atoms and you throw them down. That's not your momentum. So we had two basic views. One view was it's equivalent of water. You're opening the floodgates, so to speak, and the current begins to flow. So meaning that first burst of electricity is you, which means you'd be liable for the first act of this, meaning if you turned on a lawnmower on Sunday and walked away and it hurt somebody 3 days later, you can't really attribute that to you, although that might be negligent on a number of levels. But it's not you in terms of agency. And there was the other view that said it's actually like the case of the arrow. You just lift up the blockage and the current begins to flow, nothing to do with you. Which means that there are two extreme views. Either electricity is you, at least initially, or it's not. And we went through the cases of matzah and tzitzit and tefillin and sifrei Torah, and essentially we came down to the view that we kind of observe both positions here. When it comes to liability, we say it is you. And when it comes to responsibility or obligation, we say it's not you. So writing a Sefer Torah, we say you can't press a button and then have an electronic arm inscribe a Sefer Torah. That's not you. But if you press a button and it kills someone, that is you. And that's going to connect precisely to where we begin today when it comes to Shabbos. What do we do on Shabbos with electricity? And this is the second installment of this discussion where we shift away from agency, although that will be our launching point, to is flipping a switch considered to be a malacha, considered to be prohibited on Shabbat. So this is just an ad from the latest Shabbos lamp, light up your Shabbat. But we will begin with the question of putting lights on, because that is the most central question that usually comes up in regular Shabbat electronic life. At least it was until 5 years ago when we didn't have phones in our pockets all the time. And it was just like, can I turn a light on? Can I not turn a light on? And the truth is, we're not going to read all these sources because we have limited time. But the back and forth, I'll give you the bottom line when it comes to lights. It depends on the light. If it is a filament light, it's not even a question about electricity at that point. The assumption on the part of the decisors is that, again, if electricity has agency for liability, if something is happening that's not good and you put the switch, we consider as if you did it. And lighting up a filament lamp, can you see the filament lamp? It's blocked on my screen. Can you see it? So that filament lamp in halachic literature is considered to be a biblical prohibition, the equivalent of lighting a fire. The text on your page on your screen here is a back and forth about whether to light a fire on Shabbos, you need to have a physical fire that's burning and consuming, or does it just have to heat up and be hot? And you may be fascinated, I won't say you will be fascinated, you may be fascinated to know what one of the sources is that some of the halachists use to prove that to be a fire, it doesn't have to consume anything, and a filament lamp is just lit, even though it's not burning anything, even it's just operating, it's slowly wearing out the filament, but it's not burning. What proof is there that you can have a fire that is a light, but not burning anything?
Yeah.
Excellent. Absolutely. Yes, the halachists say, Moshe Rabbeinu, it describes in the Pasuk that there was a fire that was ignited and not burning. And so even though that's somewhat homiletic, all the positions agree that lighting up a filament lamp is a biblical prohibition on Shabbat, completely independent of the question of electricity on Shabbat and totally dependent on the question of electricity and agency, which is you flip the switch, it's as if you just took a flame and you started a fire, which would be completely prohibited on Shabbat. So to some degree, that question is now moot. Although in the house that I'm living in at the moment, there's still some filament lamps. I'm sure for many of us, or most of us, most of the lights in our houses are no longer filament lamps. and they are a combination of fluorescent. Is there a heated filament in fluorescent lights?
Yes.
No, the clue's in the name. It's not a filament light. And LED, which these bulbs on the screen are now, they do not operate with a gas like you have in fluorescent. They have they do emit light, but it does not get hot enough to be determined to be burning at all. So LED lights, again, strictly speaking, are not under any malacha on its own, and we return the question to, is electricity considered labor on Shabbat? So I just wanted to throw out there the first question when it comes to lights on and off. If it's a filament light, the question of electricity doesn't even need to get off the ground because we're talking about lighting a fire in halachic terms. The next question some of you may have, which is independent of the electronic question, which is fascinating to me and a recent discovery on my part because I don't have a Kindle. I don't know, do people have Kindles anymore? Did people move on technologically? Some people have Kindles still. Kindle, which ironically in the name suggests it's a fire, does not get that hot to be a problem. However, there was a question posed in the Maria Bazak, which is published in Israel. It's a series of responsa on halachic modern cases. And here's the question. Sheila, ha'im mutar lishtabesh b'machshir Kindle likriyat svarim b'Shabbat. Can I use a Kindle to read on Shabbos? Which sounds like it's just a standard electricity question. I'm using an electric thing. Tshuva, the answer was asur, as you may be expecting generally in halachic literature, forbidden. Lahashtamesh b'machshir a Kindle b'Shabbat. Why? Mishum shahatzagat hakitav, because the appearance of the text al mesech ha-Kindle on the screen of the Kindle asura mishum melechet kotev is a problem because of writing. V'chol ha'avarat amud, and every time you turn a page on a Kindle, or you press the button, or whatever you do to a Kindle to turn the page, mechika, it's erasure shel ha'amud hayashan, of the old page, v'ktiva shel amud chadash. Now, is that just stretching, pulling at straws, or whatever the term is? This is the note to 1. Lo asaknu b'tshuva zeh. We are not even talking at this point, it says in the tshuva, behebet shal isur shai shimush b'chashmal, about the question of electricity. That is independent of this discussion. Al kol panim asur l'shtabesh b'machshir mishum haktiva l'masach. The problem here is about the writing on the Kindle screen in particular. And Kindle as a brand is particular to this discussion. Why? Because it uses electrophoresis. And you can look that up on Wikipedia later. It is a certain screen that, if you ever wonder why a Kindle looks so real when you look at it, it's because it's not just light emitting screens like you have on your laptop. It has a certain ink inside that is charged electronically and made to float in the shape of letters. That's why it looks quite real. And it can replace books for a lot of people, which is why on Shabbat, again, independent of the question of electricity, it's deemed a problem of writing, of ktiva. Now, having said that, those are the only 2 cases I'm going to give you at the moment that just express the point that when it comes to electricity on Shabbat, the first question you have to ask is, what is the electricity doing? Because if it's doing something which is a malacha, it's not a question about electricity anymore. It's a question about the result. And turning a light on, if that light is a filament light, it's not an electricity question. It's a filament question. If the machine that I'm pressing is moving ink around, the question is no longer about electricity because we believe in electronic agency. The question is about writing. Now, think of a case where I press a button on a circuit and something happens that is not a malacha. Give me an example. Excellent, a fan. I know nobody said that, but some of you may have been thinking it. Here's an electric circuit, and it's worth reviewing how electric circuits work with my basic physics, which is you have a battery, you don't actually need something to show the circuit's working, and you have a brake. You'll see here little arrow points. That's very helpful for you to show you where you press to connect right in that little gap here. I don't know why I'm pointing with my finger. That little gap, you push down on the button. There you go. And it will close the circuit. And every time that closes, the fan begins to move. Now, is there a prohibition of the fan moving on Shabbos?
No. Shema Yitake.
Say again.
Shema Yitake.
Oh, it's
okay.
Circuit.
Well, now we're going to get to the circuit. The question of whether you're going to fix it might be an interesting question. There are rabbinic prohibitions on riding bikes, for example, lest you come to fix it. again, these were formulated in an age when fixing was pretty recurrent because machines weren't that reliable. In an age when machines are incredibly reliable, meaning you can open your fridge, we're not worried it's going to break and you might come to fix it. So that's a somewhat of a gray area. The general position is a fan in working condition does no malacha, blowing air around. I can, as Jay was doing quite willfully, you can move your hand around on Shabbos like that. You can pick up a piece of paper on Shabbos and go like that. You can get one of the big fans that flower out. There's no malacha. So if I press a button here and the fan goes, the only question I need to know is completing a circuit, is flipping a switch, is charging a current prohibited on Shabbat? Now, here's my question to you. How do I determine if something is prohibited on Shabbat? What is my go-to to figure out if something is permitted or prohibited on Shabbat? The 39 malachot. Excellent. And I'm not going to tell you how many hours of my life I spent putting this next screen together. Because if you search online for a nice image of the 39 malachot that's in good quality, you're not going to find one. And if you do, don't tell me about it because it'll make me feel sick. So there are 39 malachot. They are split into 4 different groups, which again, until one thinks about it in this context, they sound kind of arbitrary. But if you think about it logically, there are 4 groups in the 39, which, anyone familiar with Maslow's pyramid? Anyone know what Maslow's pyramid is in psychology?
Self-actualization.
Was that Stu?
Yes.
Excellent. You have self-actualized. Excellent. Yes, Maslow's pyramid is, you probably know more about it than I do, so I'm now going to be out of my depth. Maslow's pyramid essentially is the belief that there are fundamental needs that become, the more essential they are to human flourishing, food, shelter, health, are at the bottom of the pyramid. And then comes comfort. Then comes wealth, then comes luxury, whatever it is in the pyramid. And unless you complete the bottom rung, you can have a beautiful home, but if you don't have any food, you're in distress. So there's a pyramid. And actually these 39 halachot in the 4 groups form in some way, lahavdil, a Maslow's pyramid of human existence. The first set are to do with food, about the production of bread. And these are plowing, planting, harvesting, gathering, threshing, winnowing, separating, dissecting. Tochen, some of you might be thinking, really means grinding. Why on earth has he put dissecting there? And the answer is, to some degree, because tochen is more complicated. There are some views that cutting up vegetables into very small pieces might be a problem of tochen. You're not grinding anything. It's about making something into smaller and smaller pieces. Either way, each one of these malachot could have a series of shirim unto themselves. But the question I would pose as we look at these is, how many of these do you think might be the problem with electricity? Raise your hand, or don't raise your hand, I can't see it. Tell me if you think when I say something that you are doing this when you flip a switch. Plowing, planting, harvesting, gathering, threshing, winnowing, separating, dissecting, sifting, kneading. Ofer, I didn't have room for the English, is baking or cooking. Okay, so we've determined that that first rung on the pyramid of malachot, the food making procedures, are not breached by electricity. Okay. So
wait a minute, well, let's say about harvesting. Maybe you're harvesting electricity from a source and using it in that manner?
Go on, what do you mean?
Well, let's say you go over and there's a source of electricity, it's a battery, and you're harvesting some of the electricity out of the battery. Would that be possibly considered harvesting?
That's a fascinating question. I can't see you. I think that's Harold, right?
That's correct.
So before I even answer your question, I have to say mazel tov to you and Fran again on the wonderful simcha yesterday on Lauren's wedding. And I just want to wish you many more smachot. We should celebrate together in person, spend time together. Really, I just want to wish you mazel tov on this wonderful occasion and applaud you for coming in on the night after to a shir and for thinking so cogently about what electricity might be and trying to make it problematic for all of us. So I wish you mazel tov to you.
Thank you for the mazel tov.
No problem. Yeah, it's an interesting thought. Nobody else has taken that view in halachic literature. I'm sure somebody may have thought about it as you have creatively, but it's not been recorded in any sources. Again, because even though on occasion these are allegorized, So that when we talk about planting, for example, Zorea is a malacha. You can't plant seeds. It may astonish some of you, and again, this would deserve treatment on its own, but for some halachic authorities, opening a window in your house, you have breached the malacha of Zorea. Because by opening a window, fresh air comes in and it nurtures a plant, it allows it to flourish more, and maybe that's a degree of Zorea. Again, so on occasion, it doesn't have to be the literal definition of putting a seed in the ground. So harvesting, you might make that claim. However, having said that, harvesting does have to relate to food in the same way that Zorea has to apply to plant life. So that may be a step too far in the metaphorization process, but it's an interesting thought. Nobody else has taken that view so far. Now, the next set, we've done bread making, food. We now come to fabric or clothing. And again, when thought about in this way, these malachot, again, are not arbitrary or random or just antiquated behaviors to build a tabernacle. They are what construe human life. So first we have food making. Doesn't seem to be a problem with electricity. Second comes fabric. We have shearing. And again, as I say these, think about whether any of these may be the problem with electricity. Shearing, laundering, combing, dyeing, spinning, warping, threading heddles. Good luck figuring out what threading heddles are. Oreg, weaving, separating two threads, tying, untying, sewing, tearing. Now, again, all of these ripple through halachic literature in terms of their application. But none of them really seem to be the issue when I flip a switch. I'm not shearing anything. I'm not spinning anything. I'm not threading heddles, unless you tell me what a heddle is, and I am. I'm not tearing. I'm not sewing. There's no thread. There's no fabric involved here. So this is not from this strata of the pyramid. So next we come from food and clothing to, again, what seems to me in the pyramid, shelter, which is the production of hide, which again, you can wear leather, but again, if you have a fabric tent, especially as fabric was in those days, wind gets through pretty easy, rain gets through pretty easy. If you have a hide or a skin tent, it's watertight and it stops the wind getting in. That's what these pyramid, and this is the third, there's only one more after this. So the first again is food production, the second is fabric or clothing, the third is shelter or hide. So trapping, when you do electricity, again on its own, I put a fan on or I just complete a circuit. It has no result, I'm just completing a circuit. Am I trapping? No. Am I killing? No. Skinning, curing, smoothing, scoring, cutting. I spelled cutting wrong, it's cuting. I guess that might be cute if I knew how to spell. Now, none of those are the problem with electricity. So now we come to the fourth level. And again, as we go up the pyramid of human existence, it's more likely we head in the direction of electricity, which really is on Maslow's pyramid in the secular realm, pretty high up. Do I need electricity to live? In the current world, it could be that we're so entangled in it we do. But again, in an abstract vacuum, I don't need electricity to live. I can survive on food, with clothing and shelter. But then there are other things, and this next step in the pyramid is more about society. Writing and erasing, building and demolishing. Makeh b'patish is the most difficult to define of these malachot, which is makeh b'patish. How would you translate that?
Finishing up.
Finishing, right. I've translated it here as perfecting because there were a couple of different ways to go and that fit best. But makeh b'patish means hitting with a hammer, and it means the final blow. Now, what on earth is a final blow? Unless any of you are black or silversmiths, I'm not sure how often any of us make a final blow to anything. One example I'll give to this is we have a couple of strollers at home, and some of the latest strollers, especially in Chicago when we were going across snow relatively often, even in August, that's not true, but relatively often, inflatable tires are very helpful. However, inflatable tires do something that non-inflatable tires don't do. What do?
Deflate.
Correct, they deflate. And when they deflate, you need to re-inflate them. So if you're on the street and they deflate and it's Shabbos and you've got this handy dandy pump that comes with it, can you just pump it up on Shabbos? And the response we got when we asked that question was makeh b'patish. No, meaning you're turning something that is not useful into a useful vessel. You are turning a piece of rubber into a wheel. And again, I'm not a silversmith, I'm not a blacksmith, I'm not forming the last blow on a tool or on an object of honor. I'm just turning something useless into something useful. Again, on Maslow's pyramid, in the structure of halachic malachot, this is high up. Having working vessels comes after shelter, food, and clothing. But that's what Makeh B'Padish is. Mechaber and Mavir, lighting fires, and Hotzah, carrying, again, are somewhat difficult to define, but form this section. Now, of those last group, how many might be electricity? If I say writing, erasing, building, demolishing.
Mavir.
Say again?
Mavir.
Mavir, okay. So Mavir is the second from the end. I didn't have space for the English, forgive me. Mavir is lighting a fire. Now, why is lighting a fire electricity?
You determine that you are moving the electrons from one area to another.
Excellent. Now, I conveniently predicted you might say that, which is why they have now turned purple. And I predicted you might say that, not because I am a prophet, but because somebody else suggested that. Rav Michael Epstein, the author of the Aruch HaShulchan, suggested initially, and he was living right at the turn of the 20th century, he suggested that maybe this is an issue of Mavir. However, he didn't have the scientific knowledge that you have about the electrons. They really didn't know how electricity worked. And he thought maybe there is this fire rushing around inside a wire. Now, if there was, would the wire be hot or cold?
Hot.
Hot. It could be that in those days it got pretty hot because they weren't that efficient. They didn't have resistors. They didn't know how to master it that well. Nowadays, I'm holding a wire in my hand that's charging this laptop as we speak. It's not very hot. And if it was, I would unplug it straight away because I'd be worried about it exploding. There's no fire involved. There was some who suggested it was Mavir. Nobody feels that way anymore because the science has been updated, or meaning our understanding of the science has been updated. There were some who said, well, when you do electricity, what do they always tell you in school when you flip a switch? What's the problem?
Making a circuit.
So making a circuit will come to, excellent. I remember people saying, well, it makes a spark. And when it makes, right. So in reality, when I plug in my laptop, again, I hope there's no spark. When I flip the switch on the light in my house, sometimes there's a spark, but that really means I need to tighten some of the connections. There should not be a spark when I flip a switch, unless, again, I'm turning on a light that has light in it, like a filament lamp. So the whole view that this might be because of sparks, which again, there's no malacha of making a spark, right? There's a malacha of mavir, of making a fire, and a rabbinic, in the Mishnah in Beitzah, it says if you make sparks out of stone, it's a problem because it's an extension of this rabbinically. Nobody feels that sparks really the issue with electricity because it's not the usual way of making. If I wanted to make a spark, I would not try to find a circuit and hit a circuit, number one. So it's unusual. Not only is it unusual, it's unseen. The sparks are usually not visible to the eye. That's not a good spark. It's also not your intention. So there are three compound reasons why sparks are not an issue. So we're left now, what malachot might it be?
Makeh B'Padish.
Oh, Makeh B'Padish, and wonderfully, I predicted this and turn it purple. Unfortunately, I predicted it at the same time as you saying Boner, because they
could be either one.
Yeah, exactly. They do go together. And who knows who took the view that it is Boner? Building.
The Malbim?
Oh, well, the Malbim took a view on everything. He did happen to predate a lot of these applications, but he would have had every view on the matter, but the most authoritative, of course. Excellent. The Chazon Ish, so we'll come to him in a moment. Now, hold on a minute. If I were to put all these on a table in front of you or on a screen in front of you and said, pick which one is electricity, my sense is that our intuition would take a long time to land on bonet, on building. I turn on a switch to put a light on the ceiling, or I flip a switch to put I'm building? What am I building? So what am I building?
You're building a circuit.
Building a circuit. So that brings us to the Chazon Ish. Now, which man on this screen is the Chazon Ish? Anybody know, left or right?
The one with the beard.
The
white
one
beard.
with the beard. Excellent. Any other guesses? The one with the hat? Yes. The one with the glasses? Yes. Which one is it?
Left.
The one with the beer.
The one, did someone just say the Chazon Ish is the one on the left? Because
Yeah.
that would not be an accurate description of the Chazon Ish. He does happen to be on the left in this picture. He was not on the left in any other matter. But that is the Chazon Ish there. He was an incredibly authoritative figure in halachic life. He was born in Kosovo at the end of the 1800s, 1878. He moved to Eretz Yisrael and spent the end of his life in Bnei Barak, where he established a following and a major authority over the neighborhood. A lot of what happens in Bnei Barak still follows his rulings, even if they weren't accepted more broadly. So he's the Chazon Ish. And the Chazon Ish, he died in 1953, if I remember correctly. Yes, 1953. And this is what he said. He says, "B'ptichad hachashmal," in starting electricity, that's not good. The lights in the building just went off, but okay. We'll still manage. Shemachnisim, has the light gone off anywhere else in the neighborhood, or is this just the timer?
No, that's very well staged.
Yeah, all right. I feel like I should tell you a ghost story. Okay, so if anybody does have access to the lights in the shul and feel like turning them on, feel free to do that. In the meantime, I'll carry on. When you turn on electricity and it starts to run through the wires, you have turned it into a material object. He doesn't even say maybe, he says vadai. Of course, this is bona. You are building. And since turning it on is building, turning it off is destroying. Two different malachot, he's saying, because you are building a circuit. Now, somebody gives me a devil's advocate argument why closing a circuit should not be considered building. I'll give you a little clue.
Because it's designed to go on and off.
Okay, excellent. So that's one argument. And let's put this together with Makeh B'Patish, that when you close the circuit, you're turning it into an object. You're not just building like you're building a building, but you're turning it into a useful object. So I think that was my call. And Michael's point is exactly on point. For a number of the authorities, which here is encapsulated in the view of Ravadi Yosef, nobody really holds of the Chazon Ish at the moment, apart from people in Bnei Barak probably, that how can you call it building? It's going on and off 100 times a day. It was designed for that. Give me another example of something in life which, if you close, looks like it's completing something, but it's designed to open and close all day long.
The
I'll give you
door.
a clue. Ah, excellent. Somebody picked up on the screen. A door. If I open and close a door, I'm completing a wall, right? No, it's meant to open and close. So if I'm opening and closing a circuit all day, how can that be building? And Rav Shlomo Zalman Auerbach and others say precisely on the basis that it's a wall, that it's like a door opening and closing, they can't be bona. And we are rapidly running out of malachot to encapsulate electricity under. So it can't be bona, it sounds like. A Makeh B'Patish with another suggestion, because you're completing an object. Now give me another object in human life where I turn something or I lift something and it starts to function and then I can turn it off again. And we do that on Shabbat all the time.
Refrigerator.
Okay, refrigerator is interesting because refrigerator, does anything change when I open it?
The engine starts working harder once you reclose it.
So that's an excellent question. That's an excellent discussion, because there you are engaging electricity indirectly. So we'll come to that a little later.
A faucet.
Ah, excellent. I turn my tap on all the time. You call it a faucet. I lift the tap on. Guess what? When it's closed, nothing's happening. I turn it on. Oh, it's starting to function. Makeh B'Patish, don't turn it off. Of course, there are things, and this is an extension of Michael's earlier point. If something's designed to go on and off all the time, it's not like inflating the tire on the stroller. It's now a useful object. It's designed to go up and down all the time. So Makeh B'Patish and bona have essentially been dismissed as really the problem with electricity. Now, so which malachot are we left with?
Mavi.
Which one? Are you still there? Have I lost you?
Still here.
Oh yeah, it just struck me. If electricity is gone, the Wi-Fi will go at some point. So if we disappear, forgive me.
No, it'll stay on. It's just the lights.
Oh, it's just the lights on a setting? I shouldn't worry about some sort of... Okay, good.
Beware of people in hockey masks. Other than that, you're fine.
If I could see anybody, I'd worry about people in hockey masks. I can't see a thing. If I hear anything, I'll let you know. Okay, so the answer to the question is it's 9:34. I think we'll carry on for just a couple more minutes. Forgive me. Is anybody signed on for 9:30, Mariv? Speak up if you have. Okay, so with your permission, we'll just do a couple more minutes. We didn't cover all the ground yet. We'll do a little more time. And of course, you can sign off if you need. This will be recorded, please God, and you'll be able to listen in on the recording. Now, we've said so far, it can't be Bona, it can't be Makeh B'Patish. Ma'avir, we said, no one really believes that anymore. The sparks, which are rabbinic anyway, doesn't work. So what are we left with? And the answer is nothing, really. There is no malacha, which we can hang electricity on. Again, if we think about the malachot as about a pyramid of human structures, the most fundamental that there are, about making food and clothing and shelter and society, it seems like maybe electricity is a kind of icing on the cake, doesn't even make an appearance in those malachot. So what are we left with? Now, wearing perfume is not a problem on Shabbat. Spraying perfume onto clothing may be a problem on Shabbat. Rabbinically, it is called molid because you are investing the garment with something new. And there was a rabbinic prohibition taken in the spirit of the malachot, precisely in line with what we're saying, that the fundamental needs of human existence are encapsulated in the malachot. But there are things beyond that are not human essential needs, but we do. And in the spirit of the malachot, of catering for human need, there were rabbinic enactments that said, don't do this either. One of them is molid, which is making a new state, taking a scarf and spritzing it with perfume or with cologne, gives it a new scent, and that kind of sticks in it. That's the prohibition of molid on Shabbos. And the Bet Yitzchak in this top box here, Rabbi Yitzchak Shmelkus says, Isur b'davar, lefines dati, says, in my humble opinion, yesh isur b'davar, there is a prohibition with electricity, v'shomer nafsho yirachek mizeh, and someone who cares about their soul should stay away. Now, usually, when a halachist says v'shomer nafsho, and someone who cares about their soul should stay away, they know that they're making an argument that is not necessarily intuitive. Nobody says you shouldn't murder in Jewish law. V'shomer nafsho yirachek mizeh, and someone who cares about their soul should stay away. It's obvious you shouldn't be killing. You don't have to be a sensitive soul to know that. But you should be a sensitive soul, he's saying, to understand electricity is a problem. Mishum da'adiyeh skirat zerem ha'elektriki, I read that wrong, but someone who is clothing someone who's got an electric stream, nolad koach electri, you are birthing an electric force. When you flip a switch, you are starting a current which is new. Now, scientists among you, is it new? No, meaning in many ways, the comparison to a water stream is quite apt. If I lift up a floodgate and water starts to flow, yes, I've started a stream of water, but I didn't birth anything, it's just moving. And in many ways, that's true of electricity. But he says it's because of molid. Now, there's a figure here on the right hand of the screen, some of you may know, Rav Aaron Lichtenstein, passed away a few years ago, Rosh Hashiva at Gush, very influential figure in the modern Orthodox world, son-in-law of Rabbi Soloveitchik, I guess is a credential, although he, of course, stands on his own 2 feet as a giant in Jewish life.
Wasn't he your Rebbe?
Say again?
Wasn't he your Rebbe?
He was my Rosh Yeshiva. If I say Rebbe, it sounds like I'm claiming more than I have to make it sound like we had a deep personal connection. And the truth is, I mentioned, I think in the past, I did when I was in English try to bother him every day. I didn't try to bother him every day, but I did try to ask him a question every day, which I'm sure was a bother. But there are people who are far closer with him than I was, and I was there in the later years. But yes, I see him as my Rosh Yeshiva. And on the left is a figure some of you may recognize, some of you may not, Rabbi Shlomo Zalman Auerbach, who was a leader of the Haredi world in Israel for a long period. And Rav Aaron Lichtenstein was of a firm belief that when you go to a new place, you need to have a guide or halachic advisor who understands the culture that you're in and kind of is familiar with the world in which you live. And so, of course, his father-in-law, Rav Soloveitchik, was an authoritative figure in his life, but he was in America, so he saw Rav Shlomo Zalman Auerbach as a destination, and they did develop a kinship. And Rav Shlomo Zalman Auerbach is one of the major voices when it comes to electricity on Shabbos. When he was a relatively young man, he saw this as his calling to assess what is the problem with electricity on Shabbos. He wrote a volume called Ma'orei Ha'esh on the subject. He's written a number of responses on the subject, and essentially, despite whatever stereotypes we may have of the Haredi world being overly conservative, again, lowercase c, he essentially came to the conclusion that he's examined the science, he's examined the literature, and he just doesn't get it. He can't understand what the problem with electricity might be. These are his words. Ulam, bi'ikara davar, in the essence of the matter, nireh le'aniyat da'ati, it seems in my humble view, she'ein isur lahafil hazerem b'Shabbat. There is no prohibition, and I pray to God the electricity doesn't cut off in here at that point. There's obviously more to say. There's no bottom line being determined, but this is pretty radical. Shein isur lahafil hazerem b'Shabbat. There is no prohibition on putting on an electric circuit on Shabbos, ela machmat hatotza'ah shena'aseh l'derech hashmal, unless there is a result produced by the electricity, kamo bishul v'hadlakah, as we said. If you're turning on an electric oven and cooking, you are cooking on Shabbos, which is a prohibition. If you turn on an electric light that's got a filament, you're starting a fire halachically on Shabbos. Shemitchachez elav, because it's as if you did it. Keilu hu mavashel madlik biyadayim. That agency is true. Masha ein kain benidon shaladu. But in our case, when it's just putting on a current, or in our case, let's say putting on an LED light, you've got an LED bulb, there's no problem with mavir, you flip a switch and it goes on. What have you done? Oh, fantastic. That's what you've done. You've put light on. I don't know if somebody came to the shul to did that. If you did, I'm deeply grateful. If that was a ploy to make me finish the share early, well played, bad luck. I know Rabbi in Gush used to have his lights on Friday night set to go off at 10 o'clock and then back on at 10:30 so we could get rid of the guests and then read. So that may have been your plan here, but we shall persevere. So, this is Rosh Shlomo Zalman Auerbach. She'ein ani yodea. I simply do not know ezo iser yesh b'davar. What iser there is. Ve'i efshar lechadesh ma'atzmeinu. And we should not be innovating on our own. Sheyesh b'achnasat zerem mishum iser molid. That, is molid. We shouldn't just be inventing things. Va'al kol panim. And even if you're going to say that, al kol panim iser Torah vadai later. There is certainly no biblical prohibition. However, this is the key sentence when it comes to halachic life, as we've said, certainly in the diaspora. You can imagine Rosh Shlomo Zalman Auerbach and Rav Yitzchak Shmelkes and the Chazon Ish sitting on the dais of a Sanhedrin and debating this issue, us waiting outside with the press to hear where the Supreme Jewish Court falls and how big the vote was, but we don't live in that world. So what do? He says, ma e'aseh, what am I going to do? Shekfar hora zaken, that the zaken, not meaning the elderly, meaning an honorific, the elder has already decided, that which we've seen has already been decided. Rosh Shlomo Zalman Auerbach essentially falls on the position after extensive study, research, investigation, and analysis. There is no malacha that electricity falls under, and he can't even think of a rabbinic prohibition that it falls in line with. The sparks are not an issue. He says, molid doesn't seem to be an issue. Putting fragrance in a clothing, it sticks. I turn on a switch, it moves. I turn it off and it stops. I do that, as Michael said, 100 times a day. That's not molid. It's not new. It's like lifting up my faucet 3 times a day. That's not molid. And the summary we can find here, and we'll just do one more screen, and forgive me, I'm sorry we're going over. This is the Pninei Halacha, which is a contemporary halachic compendium, still in the middle of being put together, different volumes. A rabbi living in Israel, whose name I am blanking on. Is it Rav Dov Lior? Somebody can jump in if it's not. I'm pretty sure it's not. Say again?
Rav Melamed.
Thank you, Rav Eliezer Melamed. Corin is actually producing some English translations of it piece by piece. And this is his summary. And it's an excellent work because, number one, it's very, very accessible even in the Hebrew. It's also very brief, and it's in bullet points. And it blends the halachic bottom line with some of the philosophical thoughts as well. And this is his survey here. Ledat Rabim, in the view of many, hafa'alat machshirim chashmaliyim, the operation of electric things, which does not result in one of the prohibitions, in one of the malachot, asura midivrei chachamim, is prohibited rabbinically, mashum shehi ma'aseh shel chol, because it is a weekday activity. Now, what else is prohibited as a weekday activity? There are a few things, but they don't really register on the radar. As an example, there are some people, some of you may know about people who have like a Shabbos toothbrush, because there is a view that having the same toothbrushes during the week, it's called uvdin dachal. It's like it feels too weekday-y. It sounds so flimsy to say that, hold on a minute, you're saying halachically, electricity on Shabbos is like using my weekday toothbrush? And of course, I'm not suggesting in a direct parallel, the function of a toothbrush in our life and electricity are not the same, although Harold may disagree. But they're not equated. But that is essentially, in theory, what we're saying, that is rabbinically prohibited as a weekday activity. There's no biblical prohibition. And that's the view of Rosh Zalman Auerbach and the Tzitz Eliezer, two massive authorities in halachic life. Now, I should say there are a minority of views who believe at this point in history, pre-2016, that it is biblically prohibited, either on the basis of the Chazon Ish or for other reasons. But the majority view, Rav Shechter, Rosh Zalman Auerbach, getting to the year 2016, and the reason I make that distinction we'll come to next week, but pre-2016, the majority view is electricity on Shabbos is rabbinically prohibited. There is no malacha. It is a rabbinic prohibition. Now, why is that important? And I don't want to imply from that, oh, so I'll just forget it. And the best metaphor I can think of, that some of you may have a better one, is the difference in American law between something that is constitutionally law and something that is legislated by Congress. If Congress writes a law and I break the law, what happens to me?
Get arrested. Jail.
Anybody?
Go to jail.
Oh, I didn't hear. Yeah, I go to jail. If I break the law, it doesn't matter whether it's constitutional law or congressional law, it's enforceable and punishable, and I go to jail, or I pay a fine, or I go to court, right? What's the distinction between constitutional law and legislated law? The main distinction is whether it's mutable or not. Can Congress legislate to overrule its previous legislation? Congress has the power to undo legislation and redo legislation, but zero power to undo constitutional law without a constitutional constitutional convention. Without that, you can't change the constitution. So, lahavdil, however many havdalah you would like, biblical law is immutable. We don't have the power to change that. Rabbinic law, again, if we were to have a Sanhedrin and an existing body of rabbis, could change the law here and there. But it's still enforceable, it's still punishable, it's still illegal. So even if electricity on Shabbos is only rabbinically a problem, that doesn't mean, oh, it's just a suggestion of the rabbis. It's still Jewish law. It's still halachic life, which is illegal and enforceable. It's just less immutable. And in theory, that means it might change if we had a Sanhedrin that could overrule, or if we had views that shift over time, which we'll come to. But in the meantime, we're stuck pre-2016. That's the bottom line. Electricity is rabbinically prohibited. Now, what is the difference? Even though rabbinic law is still illegal and it's more mutable, there are some other distinctions, and forgive me, I know we've gone way over time. I'll wrap up in the next couple minutes because I do want to conceptually come to a comfortable stopping point. Now, a difference between biblical law and rabbinic law is not just the legal theoretics that it might change over time, but there are dispensations where the rabbis in their law codified that there would be exceptions. Rabbinic law insists on things with inbuilt exceptions. One of those exceptions we covered earlier in the year in a series of shirim. Anyone know what I'm talking about? Kavod habriot, right? We did a series on human dignity. It was only 2 shirim, and we actually didn't get to the end of everything. But if there are considerations of human dignity, of kavod habriot, it was built into the system that overrides rabbinic law, which is now radical and seems to imply that if Shabbat, I have an issue of human dignity, kavod habriot, that could be resolved by engaging something electronic, there's room to do that. Now, that is not a blank check to say, well, my dignity involves me being able to see in the dark, I'm going to flip all the lights on. And of course, we need to figure out what dignity really involves. And that was the complicated factor in that discussion. What really is human dignity? At the time we said if human dignity overrides halachic, rabbinic law, doing mincha is a rabbinic obligation. So why don't I just say I'm in the middle of a meeting, it would be undignified for me to walk away, skip mincha. Nobody says that because that's not really dignity, that's just preference. And drawing that line is complicated, but there are other dispensations. For example, on Shabbat, if somebody is ill, and in danger, what do we call that? Koach nefesh, you break Shabbat. You take them to hospital, you get in a car, you turn on a filament light, you cook food, if that's what they need to survive. That's not a question. But there is another kind of sick where I'm sure many of us have experienced a debilitating headache, where you're not going to say my life is in danger, but you say, I need to lie down. I'm very uncomfortable. I don't feel well. That's a choleh, an ill person, she'ein bo sakana, that is not in danger. Meaning there's no risk to life, but they're uncomfortable and they're unwell, and they need, the definition we usually have for this is, you would want to lie down because you feel so sick. Meaning not you've got a headache, but you're still sitting at the table chatting. I feel so sick that I need to lie down. That's choleh she'ein bo sakana. And in cases of choleh she'ein bo sakana, rabbinic prohibitions can be violated on Shabbat in an unusual way with what's called a shinui. And as an example of this, I guess it's somewhat complicated. My grandfather used to come and stay with us for Shabbos, and either myself or my father would go pick him up from his apartment, drive him over to our house. He'd have his little case in the boot of the car, what you would call the trunk, what I would say only belongs to elephants. And he would bring the case into the house, and in the back of the car would be medicine, his clothes, his toothbrush, everything else. One week, he came over to the house. I picked him up from his apartment, dropped him in the house. It was 10 minutes before Shabbos. We got in, and then we drove off to shul. He didn't come to shul with us. It's too far a walk. He stayed home. I came home from shul. We had a lovely dinner. We're getting ready. Okay, good night, Grandpa. Sleep well. Dov, where's my case? Where was it?
The boot.
Absolutely. If you would have said the trunk, I would have said no. Correct. It was in the boot of the car. That case is now at the shul, in the back of the car. And you should bear in mind, I grew up without an Eruv. The Eruv in the community that I grew up in postdates my leaving that community. So I now have a question. My grandfather's medication that he probably can skip, but again, he had like a triple bypass. You don't really want to take risks, but no one would say it's, life and death for the medications he was on. There's medication, his clothing. He's going to sleep in his suit. He's not going to sleep in it. He's going to borrow my clothes. He doesn't have a toothbrush. All sorts of questions. So now I'm facing on Shabbos a situation where, in theory, you could say he's a choleh she'ein bo sakana because he's not in danger, but he's in a vulnerable position. And you should know halachically, infants are considered choleh she'ein bo sakana across the board. because they're not sick, but they can't do anything on their own. They need constant attention. So somebody who's elderly and needs that constant attention can be considered cholei she'ein bo sakana in certain cases. So am I allowed to now go and get the case from the boot of the car, which can involve me, number one, carrying car keys? And again, this was, I didn't have a car that you had to press buttons and it was just a turnkey thing. I didn't have to ask the electronic question, but I had to carry keys in where there was no Eruv. I'd have to carry the case back to the house. What am I meant to do? I'll leave that with you, and I won't tell you what I did. So either way, but I can tell you what I did, but it's with the caveat that I was a young person who didn't really know what I was doing. But my assumption was, what's the prohibition on carrying? Is it biblical or rabbinic?
Rabbinic.
Biblical.
You're both right. That it was one of the malachot that we saw. Hotzah was a biblical malacha. However, for it to be a biblical problem, it has to be in a real public thoroughfare, which involves the ability to have 600,000 people walking through it. Let me give you a clue. In a place where it would be a biblical problem to carry, it is prohibited to have an Eruv. So anywhere where you have an Eruv is not a biblically prohibited zone for carrying, because an Eruv is a rabbinic solution to a rabbinic problem. You can't have an Eruv, which is why there are questions about the Manhattan Eruv. Meaning, if I were to pick the spot on earth that is the most public thoroughfare, what would you say? A lot of people would say Times Square. So now you're telling me you've got an Eruv in Times Square? It's the most public place on earth. How could it be? I'm not going to get into that, but either way. So me carrying to my car to get my grandfather's bag, it wasn't a biblically public place. It would have been a rabbinic problem of carrying. So we've got a cholei she'ein bo sakana, and there are rabbinic prohibitions involved. I can break rabbinic prohibitions in an unusual way if there's a cholei she'ein bo sakana. So what I did was, I carried the keys with my little finger, I turned it in the lock oddly, and I carried the case kind of weirdly. If anyone saw me, they would have reported me for being a nutter or something. I don't know. That's what I got it back to them. My grandfather was incredibly uncomfortable that I did that. He felt pretty guilty about it. So basically there was enough guilt to go around for everybody. But that was my resolution in the instance. And I'm not suggesting that to be bottom line. I'm just using that as an illustration that if somebody is unwell on Shabbos, you can break rabbinic prohibitions with a shinui, with an unusual element, which means if electricity is a rabbinic prohibition and somebody is sick, maybe I can use electricity with a shinui on Shabbos. If somebody's sick and I need a light on, and it's an LED, it's not a filament light, maybe I could turn it on with my elbow or my nose. That's a shinui to break rabbinic law for the sake of a cholei. Again, I'm not making bottom line recommendations here. We're just exploring the theory in an honest way. I'm going, of course, to trust everybody with this information. I'm not worried to share this to you. You're all grown thinking adults, and that's where we stand now. I'm going to use my baseline as finishing by 10 o'clock, so forgive me for going over. Having said that it's rabbinic, we said that there are certain what we might call loopholes. If it's a cholei, somebody's sick, I can do it in an unusual way. If kavod habriot is being violated, it just overrules rabbinic law. How that would manifest, I don't know. But in theory, that's the concern or consideration. Now, we come to, somebody wanted me to talk about somet. So I'm going to talk about somet very briefly, and Jay brought in his kosher switch last week as a show and tell, so we'll touch on that very briefly too. In the Gemara in Shabbat, the rabbis say, Lo ta'aseh kol malacha. The biblical prohibition says, you shall not do a malacha. And the Gemara says, asiyahu da'aser. So doing the malacha is a problem. Grama shari. Indirectly is permitted. The most basic case, I'm not going to read it all inside, of grama is something catches fire. Am I allowed to put a fire out on Shabbos?
No.
No. If it's going to, again, pikuach nefesh, yes. If it's burning out in a barn somewhere and it's surrounded by a moat and it's not going to get anywhere near the house, I can't just put it out. Let's say there are 2 barns on this moat-surrounded island, one of which is filled with all my papers, all my contracts on which my livelihood depends. And there's a fire raging in the other one and it will spread across. Now, no pikuach nefesh. My livelihood, unfortunately, may be lost. That's not pikuach nefesh in any direct sense. Am I allowed to put the fire out? No. What I can do, in halachic terms, is I can fill lots of pitchers with water, line them up in a periphery around that barn with my files, and I know that as soon as the fire reaches those pitchers, it's going to melt the pitchers, the waters will fall out and put out the fire. So am I doing it directly? No, it's grumma. That's indirect, and that's permitted according to the Gemara. However, there is a key line here. This, which as you see, is in a different script to the Shulchan Aruch. This is a Shulchan Aruch, authoritative medieval code of Jewish law. Garam kibui mutar. You can put it out indirectly. The Ramah adds, which is massively important, b'makom peseda. Anyone know what peseda is or have said?
Loss of money.
Loss. If I'm going to lose something, meaning if I've got a barn filled with all my papers and my livelihood depends on, I can do this. If I just don't want a fire raging, and it's not really going to be any loss to me, I don't want a fire. In the eyes of the Shulchan Aruch, you can put it out. In the eyes of the Ramah, you can't, because it needs to be extenuating circumstances. Now, the final piece here, the Minchat Shlomo, who is Rav Shlomo Zalman Auerbach, says, biblical prohibitions, you can't do grama carte blanche. It needs to be loss or extenuating circumstances. But rabbinic prohibitions, grama is mutar lachatchila. You want to do something indirectly and it's a rabbinic prohibition on Shabbat, go for it. That's what he suggests, which opens the door or turns the key to an institute like Machon Somet, to have these Shabbos scooters. And if you look here, it's got a Shabbos setting and a Chol setting. On the Chol setting, it's just a regular scooter. You flip it up to Shabbat, and it makes your ignition over here, when you turn the key, it does not ignite the scooter, the engine rather. It doesn't turn on the engine. When you flip it to Shabbat, it makes it an indirect current. We don't have to get to the science. It just turns it into a grumma, which again, if you believe electricity is rabbinic and you follow Rav Shlomo Zalman Auerbach, that grama on rabbinic prohibitions is permitted, this scooter should be fine for everybody. Having said that, we do have people in Jewish life, halachic authorities, that believe electricity on Shabbos might still be biblical, like the Chazon Ish. There are people who disagree with Rav Shlomo Zalman Auerbach and say actually grama is not permitted even on rabbinic law, unless there's extenuating circumstances. So Tzomet's policy is all our grama equipment, all our indirect equipment is only endorsed for use in cases of Seidah or Tzorech Gadol, extenuating circumstances. Now, what's an extenuating circumstance?
Walk.
Yeah, let's say you can't walk. My grandfather could not make it to shul on his triple bypass without passing out. So him using this with a tzarech gadol. I have a 4-minute walk from my house to shul. I may not like walking, but it's hard to say that it's a tzarech gadol that I need a scooter. But there is a gray line. What happens if I'm a 25-minute walk away? And it's very difficult for me. It's complicated, and it deserves a question at that point. But again, this is just the blanket concepts. The grama works because it's indirect. So what have we disrupted here? Not the electricity question. With the grama, what we disrupted is our question from last week. The agency. There is a remove. It's not really me doing it. And we say in cases when it's indirect, you sever that agency, but we only really let that under extenuating circumstances. Now, I said 10 o'clock, but we're going to go one more for 1 minute to address the kosher switch. Kosher switch came out, I think it was about 4 or 5 years ago. Now, what was the claim? Was the claim that this was grama? If the claim was that it was grama, who should be allowed to use it?
People in need.
Say again?
People in need.
People in need, right? So that's quite a small market. If you're marketing, I've got a switch that is like Tzomet and it's grama, so really that should be for people. Who's in desperate need to put a light switch on? Leave it on before Shabbat. What's the desperate need? It seems like there's no market. So what they were marketing was that there is not even any groma. They say what we have done with the kosher switch, thinking about our source from last week, we have turned you flipping a switch into the case of the arrow for everybody. All you're doing is you're pulling the shield out the way and the arrow is going along on its way. And there's a video you can see on YouTube of how they explain the science, which essentially is that you've got this plastic shield covering a light emitting current, and you move the shield and it fires the light across randomly. And that's essentially their argument. I'm going to share for 1 second. This is their promotional
But
video.
technological innovation is useless unless it also conforms with Jewish law. That's why we sought to validate kosher switch's halachic feasibility from day one. During years of R&D, we've been privileged to meet with Torah giants who have analyzed, endorsed, and blessed our technology and endeavors.
It is clear this is not a groma. Mitzat Hilchos Shabbos. There's no question of any malacha being done by using that switch. And Mitzat Hasheni, I recommend that anyone asks their own Rav to find out whether it is within the spirit of Shabbos, although there is no real malacha.
He has endorsements from many poskim regarding the kosher switch. So I wish him הצלחה, ברכה והצלחה בכל מעשיותיו.
ואני כבר בדקתי אותו וראיתי. ולפי דעתי, לא רק שזה מותר, גם אתה מצווה לך להפיץ את זה ברבים.
Now they even have a kosher switch. Kosher switch. You can turn the lights on Shabbat now.
Okay, so the argument there by those figures was, this is not grama. There is no malacha. In the words of the final figure, who is a controversial figure we can leave for another time, said, you can turn lights on Shabbat now. Kosher switch, not for those in need. Everybody can install it in their homes. And they had a litany of scholars who began with endorsements. However, you may have seen Rabbi Neuwirth's name came right at the front. Anyone know Rabbi Neuwirth or Neuwirth, what he authored?
Shmer Shabbat Kilchata.
Excellent. Shmir Shabbat Kehilchasa or Shmir Shabbat Kehilchata, one of the standard kind of accessible compendiums of Hilchot Shabbat. He endorsed this. That's what they wrote. He says everyone can have it in their home. However, he then came out with a letter when people came up to him afterwards and said, hold on a minute. And he said, hold on a minute. No, of course I'm not saying you can use this. I never thought about allowing this for great need, which in Israel, and here more increasingly on our radar as well, is people who are sick, and for security purposes, which again, for security purposes, I can see maybe why you might want a switch that you can turn lights on and off in great need. But he's basically saying what Rabbi Neuwirth is saying is, this is Tzomet, this is Grama, don't get carried away. This is not for everyone to install. So Rabbi Neuwirth stood back a bit. Now, Lahasir Michshol, a Shabbos alert to the Flatbush community was sent out saying, hold on a minute, this is worse than Tzomet. This is not Grama. Here it says the Grama aspect. The claim that this is less than Grama is incorrect, and even they acknowledge a Grama is prohibited. And they go back and forth saying this is worse. This is terrible. This is not to be used. And then you've got down here in the red, this device should not be brought into any Jewish home, which again seems like a stretch. Jay, you can keep it in your house if you like. It's not, tameh to hold, but this device is undoubtedly prohibited for use on Shabbos and can lead to a tragic desecration of Shmir Shabbos. And this is signed by Rabbi Belsky, who was on the OU Kashrus panel, halachic panel with Rav Herschel Schechter, David Feinstein, Shmuel Kamenetsky, Shlomo Eliyahu Miller. They all said that this kosher switch, it doesn't work. Rabbi Belsky signed something else to this effect as well, saying that the material advertising the switch is an agonizing distortion of Torah values. It portrays the holy and wonderful Shabbos as a nuisance and a problem to be solved. Get our switch, and you will be relieved from the unbearable limitations of the yoke of Shabbos. Now, we are going to end here with the following overview or summary. Pre-2016, the holding pattern in Jewish life of the overwhelming majority of halachic authorities in terms of electricity on Shabbos, prohibited or no. The bottom line was, rabbinically, it's a problem, and everybody agrees to that, which means that Tzomet means there's openings for Grama, which means Cholet, there are openings for Cholet, which means Kavod Abrios, maybe. But in 2016, everything changed. With Rav Nachum Rabinovich, who Rabbi Jonathan Sachs saw as his mentor, wrote this beautiful eulogistic statement just a couple of weeks ago when he passed away. And next week, we are going to turn to Rav Rabinovich, what he said, the reaction that people had to what he said, and basically where we stand today, post-2016, which is going to involve a loop-the-loop and may take us back some time as well. So it's not an expected outcome, but it's a fascinating one. And Rav Rabinovich, who again passed away about a month ago, who initiated a fresh look at this technology, a fresh look at how it stands in halachic life. And next week, we'll take the opportunity to explore his view, the reaction from Rav Ariel, the reaction from Rav Asher Weiss, and will bring us to the Zoom Seder controversy that some of us touched upon just a couple months ago, and where we stand today. And that will complete phase 2 of our investigation of electricity in halachic life. And then we'll have one more session, I hope, maybe lead into 2, on the next phase of our examination of electricity, is whether it can simulate things independent of Shabbos.